Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas and this is how to create an RPG in Unity, and welcome to episode 33. So this tutorial is going to be all about something called post-processing, and it is basically, in a nutshell, a way of making your game look better, or alternatively it's a way of making it look how you would want it to look rather than just plain and simple like we have at the moment. So don't forget, click the subscribe button and click the bell icon as well, and you can stay up to date with every tutorial left in this series. And with that in mind, let's get to work. So, post-processing. How do we get it? That's the first thing we have to overcome. And we can get it from the asset store. So let's head to the asset store. And remember, we can hold Control and press 9 as well, and it will open up this. It may look like it is the new asset store, so you can either shop on the old asset store or new asset store. And if you're on the old one, you can switch to the new one here. And if you're on the new one but want to switch to the old one, you'll have a little option over here in the top right. So all you need to do is search for post processing stack. And you should be able to find, hopefully, the first result is this one, post processing stack from Unity Technologies, and it is completely free. So make sure it is this one you have selected. Click on import or download to bring it into your project. Head back to scene, and I've already got it installed because I didn't want to waste time in this tutorial. So we have it, but how do we use it? How do we get it working as we intended? Well, the post-processing actually is applied via a profile onto the camera directly. So firstly, we have to establish which camera we're going to use for post-processing. We have to apply it to every camera we use as well. So before we begin, let's go to our FPS controller, go to our first person character. This is where our camera is stored. So everything we see through our game is rendered through this camera, which is attached to our first person character. A couple of things we have to do first, excuse me. We have to allow the camera to kind of be a bit more versatile, you could think of it. And we're going to want to turn off Msaa, which is multi-sample anti-aliasing. You'll see why a little later on. So make sure we untick that. And let's tick allow HDR. HDR is a way of allowing the camera to better control viewing the scene when we apply. Can't get my words out. When we apply the post processing. So basically, that helps it make a little bit nicer. All of this does kind of add a little bit of strain to your processor, I should say, but generally most computers can handle it these days, especially if you're developing something like this. If you're trying to develop, I don't know, like graphics the Red Dead Redemption 2 quality, then it's going to put a little bit of strain on the processor. But even my PC is able to run this, so it's not a problem. Next thing we have to do is go to the rendering path here and change it from use graphic settings to deferred. Again, this will allow the camera to basically make it look even better than what it does. You can achieve better lighting with all of this set the way it is. So last thing we have to do is go to edit, and let's go to project settings, and I think it is graphics. Nope, not graphics, quality, sorry. Edit, project settings, and quality. We just have to turn off here anti-aliasing, so set it to disabled. Again, you'll see why in just a few moments time. So as long as we have all that set now, so the anti-aliasing off in the quality settings, deferred as the camera, and HDR in the camera, we can make this look kind of cool now. So what do we do? Well, let's go back to our first person character where the camera is, and we'll want to go inside this runtime folder, which is inside the post-processing folder. So post-processing, runtime, and we'll want to apply this script right here, which is post-processing behavior. Apply that to the first person character. You'll see down here the component is added, post-processing, and we now need to create a profile. So to create a profile, go to wherever you want to in your assets, right click, create, and click on post-processing profile. Name it whatever you want to. I'm going to call this JVRPG. And you'll see over here we have loads and loads of options. Fog is already ticked. We'll go through as many as we can on this. Some of them won't actually be relevant in this tutorial, but maybe later on in the series. We just want to get to a point where we have our post-processing versatile enough to make this look at least something different. So what we need to do is apply this post-processing profile to this component. You won't see any difference when you first drag it over, but as we go through, we'll see plenty of difference. So let's start with fog. Ticked. Don't need to worry about that. It is what it is, and we're not going to deal with it just now. Anti-aliasing. Let's tick that, and you should instantly see some kind of change within your scene. If we turn it off, you can see it. Turn it on, see it again. So this is why we turned it off everywhere else, because we're going to use it here. I'm going to use fast approximate because I don't want to put too much strain on our processor. Again, the default settings of this are pretty decent. One extra thing to note, I can see a change within my scene. That's because here in my toggle, I actually have image effects ticked. So if you want it to appear in your scene view, you just tick that. If not, untick. Either way, you will see the changes within your game view. So anti-aliasing, yep, as default, it is pretty decent and it will do for us for now. Next on the list is ambient occlusion. What is ambient occlusion? Well, it helps light and shadows work in places they would otherwise struggle. For example, in tight corners. A good example of that is if we go all the way back to our village and let's say here. So the ambient occlusion is going to affect this kind of area here because light would otherwise struggle to kind of get into this corner section here. So if we turn on ambient occlusion, we can already see that the quality is changing. We could do with the intensity being raised just a little bit, but not too much. I want to kind of, well, how can I say this? At the moment, it looks a bit cartoony. And if you want to go for that style, that is perfectly fine. I want to give it a little bit more realism, but I don't want it too realistic. I still want it to have an element of fantasy to it. So having the ambient occlusion on and raising the intensity to full is just too much, but no intensity is not what I want. I'd like it somewhere in the middle, so I'm going to set it to about 2. Radius is obviously how far it can go. If we increase the radius, you can see it just looks a little bit daft sometimes. I've always found that the radius is pretty decent at 0.3. Maybe at a stretch we can go to 0.4, depending on how you want your game to look. So as I said, this is a good example of where ambient occlusion would work. But if we go over here, it wouldn't quite work as much because the light is already getting to it. So it's always good to move yourself around your scene just to check all your settings are going nicely. So I may put this back to 0.3. Okay, so we're getting somewhere now. It's you can see it's slowly changing. We can basically keep the sample count as medium. Downsampling is perfectly fine. Again, I don't want to put too much strain on the processor. If you're aiming for a powerful PC, then obviously untick downsampling. If not, keep it as I have. It's always best to test these things out as well. So once you've maybe got the basic settings in place for your post-processing, play the game, check it out, and you can modify. But I'll get around to that a little later on. Next on our list is screen space reflection. We could tick this, but we're not going to see much of a difference at the moment. Reason being is because we don't really have anything that is going to be massively reflective in the scene. This is something we'll probably deal with at a later date, maybe inside some kind of icy cave or something. So I'm going to untick that and leave that for now. Depth of field. Again, this is not really something that we're going to deal with too much right now. If you generally hover over things, it will give you a bit of an indication as to what things are. But again, depth of field is not something that we'll deal with just yet. Motion blur is something we'll deal with. And I've always found if we tick motion blur, we're not going to see much of a change here. We'll only really see the change in the game view. I've always found that the default settings for motion blur are actually fairly decent. So we're just going to try this out now and just see. So motion blur. If Unity decides to kick in, it's having a bit of a slow moment, isn't it? So the motion blur, like I said, is something that is, we can see it in action now. It's actually fairly decent as the default. Obviously, if we blend the frames if you understand how motion blur works, it can get a little bit visually sickly. You know, it's not really sensible to have a game like that unless you're aiming for an effect in a specific place. So I would keep the frame blending either off or very minimal. Sample count is pretty decent at 10. We'll maybe put it to 20, but as you can see, again, it affects the quality. If we have it as 10, obviously, well, you can see. So I'm actually going to keep this as 10. Worth playing around with these settings a little bit, getting the kind of style you're aiming for. Next, we have eye adaptation. What is eye adaptation? It is basically a way of, if you're going from a really dark area, like inside a cave, and then coming out into the light, it adjusts that as you go through. So you'll be able to kind of be blinded by the sun when you come out of that dark cave, and it would adjust like your eyes do in real life. If we turn it on, we're going to get a pretty dark effect. And that kind of is a little bit pointless right now because we're all in one scene or one type of area, so it's not worth having eye adaptation on. If you want to have it on, you would just need to change the histogram filter to better reflect your style of game. So I'm going to have that off just for now. Next we have bloom, good old-fashioned bloom. Some games overdo it with bloom, some games don't. I am a fan of bloom, and in a lot of ways I kind of like a lot of bloom because I really feel, especially in this style of game, it's very fantasy-like. So obviously we have the intensity, and the more we change the intensity, the more bloom we have, and you can see it quite prominently on some aspects. You can see over here from the sky, and the sky over here, the hearts, threshold gamma. Obviously, have that as 0. We can't see anything at all. Remember, you can always hold Control, press Z to undo. So let's change the threshold gamma to probably 0.4 and change the intensity to 1. And you can see that's a different kind of effect again, but like I say, it's entirely up to you what you want to do. If you ever make a mistake on any of these things and can't revert to what you had or don't know what you had, you can always click here and click on reset. So let's change the intensity to 1. Change the threshold gamma to 0.9. You can see slight bloom starting to appear. If we increase the radius and then increase the softney, you can see the softney actually adds kind of a powdery look and feel to it, as we can see. So that's why having the softney too high is a little bit bad sometimes, but you can see over here, this is where the line of the bloom actually takes effect. So let's also take anti-flicker. I may increase the intensity to 1.5 and increase the softney to about there. And yeah, that'll do for now. So it's worth playing around with these settings to see what you can do. Next, we have color grading. Now, color grading is hugely important when we come to post-processing, and it works hand in hand with bloom. So I'm going to tick color grading, and then I'm going to change the tone mapper from neutral to filmic, because I want to add that extra layer of realism, but also keep the fantasy. So you can change the post exposure here, and obviously the higher this is, the more exposed the scene will be light-wise. So if we have this as 2, you can see just how bright and blooming this scene actually is. Here we can play around with the temperature. You can see a higher temperature kind of gives it that heated look, and obviously the lower would the cold kind of dark recesses kind of thing. So I like to have my temperature probably around 30, 35-ish. We could change the tint if we wanted to. Again, that's something you'd have to work with, but you can see what the tint is doing. Hue Shift, again, it works a little bit the same as tint, but obviously it changes the hue rather than the tinting. You can see here you have kind of purple grass. Crazy. Next, saturation. Always wise to play around with saturation just a little bit. You don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to underdo it, unless you're going for that style of look. At this point, I will note that I do have a couple of other tutorials on post-processing on my channel. and you'll be able to see different ways and different effects and different things you can achieve with post-processing. So here, well, straight up, you can see this feels like a different style of game altogether, just because we've changed the saturation. Having the full saturation really brings out the colors, really brings out a different style and look of game. And then again with the contrast, too much contrast combined with too much saturation can prove a little bit silly. So it might be wise to play around with the contrast just a touch to see what kind of effects you can bring. So at the same time, the problem we're also going to have is these houses, for example, their quality is more cartoony than realistic, hence why they still look like this. There are ways of making these things look a little bit better and doing whatever else. But don't forget, post-processing and lighting together go hand in hand because they are both essential to each other. So if we were to take this house, for example, and on the normal map, if we were to change this normal map to a grayscale and click apply, and change that grayscale quality to be considerably, well, I say considerably less, but you know, a bit less than what it actually is, say to 0.5, maybe 0.7-ish, and then also change the alpha to albedo alpha and reduce the smoothness, and you can probably change the alpha cutoff down and also reduce the increase the metallic. Again, it depends what type of game you're looking for, and you can see this now looks hugely different than what it did. This is all because we can change things within Unity one way or another, whether it is through lighting, because it's the light that's technically reacting to this now because of the normal map, but again, it's something that you could probably work with. So if we go back to our first person character, click on our profile right here, and let's play around with some of these settings. So let's put the post exposure back to 0. You see it doesn't quite look right. So it's worth playing around with these to actually try and get something decent looking. So I'm going to have this as 1.5. Let's play around with the temperature. Probably about 25. Bloom. Let's increase the intensity of the bloom just a little. Well, let's do it a lot and see how this looks now. It looks utterly crazy. So I'm going to have the bloom. Let's have the bloom as 3. The softening a little bit higher. The threshold, let's have that as 0.85. And I'm going to press play now and just have a quick look at how this game looks with the settings we have. So I've got a hazy kind of look going on now, which is kind of cool. So what else do we have? Let's close up bloom and let's close up color grading. The user LUT is basically something you can create externally for the color grading. So it's kind of like a settings file that you would just bring in. We're not going to use that. We're not going to use the chromatic aberration either, because if we turn it on, there's no real point to this at the moment, because this kind of is more of an extra effect rather than a constant effect that we would have. You'll see if we increase the intensity, it'll kind of start weird blurring around. So you can see what kind of happens there. It's not really worth us using that because it doesn't fit what we're creating here. Grain, if we tick this on, we will see the grain appear. And I don't think this is really something that we would have in this type of RPG, because this is something I'd expect more horror-based. So I'm going to pretty much just turn this off. You could change the luminescence, the intensity, the color, whether you want it colored or not. But I'm going to turn it off. Vignette or vignette, turn it on. It just brings up basically dark edges, and we can increase the intensity, and you can see what that actually does. Again, I don't think it's really necessary in this style of game. So we've gone through pretty quickly how all these different post-processing effects work. I've repeatedly said about lighting as well. So let's keep these settings as they are, and let's play around with the lighting to see if we can still enhance what we see. Let's go to Window, let's go to Rendering, and let's go to Light Settings. If we were to change the intensity multiplier down, you'll then see how much this scene changes just because we've changed this right here. If we change the source to color, again, you will see a bit of a change, and we can probably put this white, you can see how it looks, put it black, see how it looks. And I guess it's up to you how you want it to look. So if I change it back to skybox, it does actually matter what the skybox is and how much light protrudes from the skybox. So we have Wispy Skybox Mobile Map 2. If we have the original, you can see how much it changes. Same with the others. It will change depending on what you actually have as your skybox. So I'm going to have that Wispy Skybox Cube Map 2. And if we look around, we can see how this game is starting to change how it looks. Now we could change our light. So let's go to our hierarchy and type light, and we have that directional light. If we turn this off, you can see just how much it's impacting everything around it. It's obviously wise not to turn that off, but what you can do is play around with the settings itself. So if we were to change the color straight to white, again, you would see a change. If we change it to orange, black, all kinds of different settings. So I'm going to change this to a bluish kind of color. Maybe a bluey green. Maybe. I'm not sure. Okay, so I'll stick with a bit of a blue, but I'm also going to change the intensity to be 0.7. So you can see how much darker it's become. But because of the lighting change, this here looks a little bit off. It doesn't quite look right. So I'm going to hold Control, press Z to undo, up to the point where we change the skybox. So the reason this has occurred like this is basically because of the skybox. So if we go to Window, Rendering, Light Settings, and change it back to skybox, we'd need to increase the intensity multiplier to actually be able to see this. But you can use this together because it means that you don't necessarily have to use the directional light in the same way. So if we were to have this quite low, maybe 0.5, let's find our directional light again. I've lost it, so I'm going to type light. And directional light, let's set the color to a yellowy kind of color. And we could increase the intensity to 2. And you can see what kind of effect this is now producing. So the bloom has gone absolutely crazy, simply because we've increased the intensity of our global light, which is the directional light. So we could always head back to this and then play around with our bloom and say the intensity is 1. And you'll see it slowly reduce. Obviously, if the intensity was 0, it wouldn't really make too much of a difference. It would be how it would be. If we have it as 0.5, again, you can see too much bloom. So I'm going to have this as 2.5, and then I'm going to change my directional light to be 1.1. So, like I said, it's probably worth playing around with these, mixing the light together, mixing the settings together to see what kind of different effects you can come up with. For me, I always feel that post-processing works better inside when you're creating internal environments, but that doesn't mean to say that you can't do it for the outside, because something like this you would have to spend considerable amount of time refining what you're doing here. Occasionally you'll get a crazy looking kind of feel. You can probably see it with the grass already. Let's quickly check this out. So if we look at the grass, it just looks a little bit pixelated. That is caused by the normal map, which is on the terrain. So if we zoom out, you can see, because the way we've got the settings for the grass, we can actually see this whole area is the grass setting on the terrain. So if we go to the terrain, go to the paint settings, go to the grass, go to edit and edit texture, we could theoretically remove that normal map. So select and click none and apply. And if we press play again and take a look at the grass, it is less pixelated. So the normal map can actually distort the image a little bit more than what you would expect it to. So I'm just going to quickly head out here and take a look at our cave that we put in last time, just to see how this looks. Let's have a quick look. So you can see it's quite sunny, it feels quite sunny. So here's our cave, and in we go. So now this cave feels quite dark and dingy. And this is a good example of where we could theoretically use our eye adaptation settings. So let's give that a go. Let's go to our first person character and click on the profile, change the profile, and let's tick eye adaptation. Let's zoom in so we can see a little bit more. And what we can do is make sure on the eye adaptation right there we have our histogram filter where you would want it to be, because again, like I said, if you need to know anything you can always hover it over, but basically the histogram filter is a way of defining how bright things can be. So if we have the eye adaptation on, and let's head over there and head into that cave, we should be able to at least get some insight as to how it feels now. So let's head up and into our cave, where it is quite dark. So it's quite dark for us, and if we head out, and there is eye adaptation right there. So you can see for that brief moment when we step out, we can see the sunlight shining through, and then as we head out, it blinds us, but then our eyes adapt and we can see again. So, as I said, all of this is important in one way or another, and working these things together can create a different effect for your game. There's no right or wrong with any of this. Honestly, there is no right or wrong. You can have it as crazy looking or as dull as you want. It's your game at the end of the day. Between now and the next tutorial, I may play around with these settings just a little bit, kind of get something that I personally like, but just because I like it doesn't mean to say that you will too. Let's increase the contrast, saturation down a little bit, maybe. Post exposure set to 1, maybe 0. Let's have it as 1. Temperature a little bit higher. Let's have a quick look. Okay. So, yeah, it's something for you to play around with. Don't ever be afraid of changing things. Remember, if you get something wrong, you can always revert right here. Let's change the contrast down. You could probably spend hours upon hours changing some of this, you know, guys. There is so much you could change, and it really is amazing what you can do post-processing. I would recommend playing around with it as much as possible, kind of looking for the right settings, whether it's through light, whether it's through the post-processing itself, to see what you can come up with. So I'm going to save my scene there. And yeah, there's still quite a bit to go. There's loads for us to do. Next, what we're going to do is I think we'll start looking at a health bar in the next tutorial, because I know that's quite a requested thing, and health bars do feel a little bit more RPG-ish, if you understand what I mean there. So these hearts could still technically play a part, but rather than have that, we could have like what we have in Skyrim, for example, a health bar down here or up here or something. So obviously, when we get hit, we decrease the health, pick up a heart, increase health. So yeah, that's coming in the next tutorial. So until then, guys, thank you very much for watching.